Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Ben Cahill. I'm a senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS, and I'm really happy to welcome everyone joining us in person and the audience online to talk about national oil companies and methane reductions. Before we start with today's program, it's my duty to read off a brief safety moment. I want to share with you our building safety precautions. We feel secure in the building, but in the event that there is any problem, you can follow the signs for the exit to your right, and the stairs are down that way. So I'm really excited to convene people to talk about methane commitments and national oil companies. This is a topic that kind of brings together two loves of mine for many years, NOCs and methane. I also think it's a really timely event. There's a lot to unpack, a lot to digest in terms of what just happened at the COP28 conference. Many people in the room here were deeply involved with efforts on methane reductions at the COP. So I'm excited to talk about that. We've got an excellent panel of speakers. And what I want to do is just really briefly kick things off with a couple slides to frame the conversation before I turn it over for opening remarks. We can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, actually, that's down to me. Next slide. So what just happened? It's impossible to summarize in one slide everything that happened on methane at the COP because a lot took place. What is here is just a brief summary. If we think about financial commitments, more than $1 billion in grant funding for methane abatement has been announced since COP27. That includes about $450 million from various philanthropies to support methane abatement between now and the year 2026. We also had a $255 million commitment for the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership led by the World Bank. We're going to hear about that today. That involves both government and industry support. In terms of regulations, there were some pretty significant moves announced at COP. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced its final rule on oil and gas greenhouse gases and VOCs. The EU, of course, agreed on its methane legislation a couple weeks ago. Canada announced draft regulations on methane, and importantly, that includes an end to routine flaring and venting. And some other countries like Egypt and Brazil have signaled but not yet shared their methane reductions. Those are supposed to be coming in 2024. But I think what we want to focus on today here is really corporate targets. And I've just flagged two of them. There are many more. The biggest one is that 50 companies signed the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. And this is a collective agreement by all these companies to set net zero Scope 1 and 2 targets, 2050 targets. And all these companies also agreed to try to reach 0.2% methane intensity or near zero by 2030 and also achieve an end to routine flaring. This is really significant. And from my perspective, it was a big win. A lot of these are national oil companies that have made net zero and methane commitments for the first time ever. It also included a number of trading houses in Asia, quasi-state companies, but it took a lot of work to get this across the finish line, and it's really exciting to see that some NOCs have stepped up. A lot of other things happened at the COP on methane. In terms of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, ExxonMobil joined, INPEX joined, PTTEP from Thailand, and a number of other companies. All kinds of interesting announcements on satellite data, new data from Climate Trace and from the International Methane Emissions Observatory and many others. It all confirmed that we're moving towards a world where suddenly there's going to be much more transparency on methane data from lots of operators. So some pretty exciting stuff. What we're here to talk about today is what all this means for national oil companies. And we've just published a report. We'll share it with everyone in the audience. The title is National Oil Companies, Climate Commitments, and Methane Reductions. And what we really focus on in that paper is just trying to understand what makes NOCs different. A little bit about their roles, their responsibilities, what governments ask them to do in terms of economic development, and how their climate strategies fit in. And what we really wanted to focus on in that particular report was creating this context. You know, everyone wants NOCs to act on methane, but it's really important to understand where these companies are coming from. Because an NOC is not like ExxonMobil or Shell or Pioneer or ConocoPhillips. They have different responsibilities, and that's what's summarized here. Economics, energy security, politics, and geopolitics. You know, these are companies that are asked to do a lot. And so I think to get these achievements on methane reductions that we want, it's important to deconflict those climate and methane goals with these core responsibilities and fit them together. This is just a quick summary of all the methane commitments that have already been made by NOCs. The column on the right shows the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. You can see here a large number of NOCs signed up for this. Again, for many, this is the first methane commitment ever. But it's not the only methane commitment that NOCs have made. Many of them have joined OGMP 2.0. They're part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. They've already signed on to the World Bank's Zero Flaring Initiative, as well as the Methane Guiding Principles. But there's still a lot of blank space on the screen. There's still a lot of NOCs that are missing. There were some notable absentees, right, from the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. So more work to be done. And I think the critical thing is that we have to focus on implementation. Pledges are great. COP28 is full of pledges. What's next? That's really the critical thing. The last thing I'll leave you with is that if we look at methane reduction targets, I'm not going to go through this in detail, it's too much, but the report covers this. A lot of NOCs have actually made methane reduction targets already. Actually, a surprising number. The trick is, are these ambitious enough and are they moving fast enough? Because the critical thing with methane is that this is the critical decade for action. We need to make the steps today to take us to the reductions that we want to see by 2030. It's all about speed and pace. So that's it, just a couple quick framing comments to start the conversation, and we'll talk about all these things, I'm sure, in more detail in the panels. Right now, what I want to do is turn it over to our first speaker. We're really fortunate to have Leslie Labruto from the Environmental Defense Fund. She's Managing Director of Sustainable Finance at EDF. She's built and led teams and impact funds at the London School of Economics, at Acumen Fund, and at the Clinton Foundation. And she's going to give some opening remarks here to give EDF's perspective on this issue. And of course, EDF has been really deeply involved in moving the ball forward on all these things. So Leslie, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That was brilliant. And the data that you shared is really timely and relevant, so thanks. So I joined EDF in just October, so fairly new to the scene. And I have to say that I'm learning that I didn't choose an easy path and no one in this room did either. We're dealing with a huge problem. It's complex, it's thorny, and it's important. And when we all think about climate change, it often feels insurmountable. But we're here today because we're dealing with a problem, or I like to say a puzzle, that is imminently solvable. Because when we're talking about methane emissions with national oil companies, we're the right people in the room to be talking about this. While there's still a debate going on right now about phase down or phase out, and this rages on, and the need for broader energy transition, that's a different conversation sometimes. It's a different set of actors, a different set of tools, and a different set of actions than those gathered around the room today. But each of you truly look to your neighbor, can directly influence the direction of a national oil company in some regard with respect to methane emissions. This is a goal within our reach, while it is complex and it is achievable. So, from the EDF perspective, there's 3 things that we know that I wanted to share today to ground us. The first is that reducing methane from NOCs is indeed one of the most important levers that we can pull on climate change in order to stabilize and ensure the conditions for the planet. National oil companies are responsible for more than half of global oil and gas production and have some of the lowest production costs in the world. Yet, they're an often overlooked opportunity when it comes to reducing methane emissions. This is especially in comparison to publicly traded companies. You might say, why? That brings me to number 2. They're not all the same. In a piece published by Ben and Kirsty, we'll read the line, NOCs are not monolithic. Petrobras in Brazil is vastly different than Sonangol in Angola. Some of these NOCs are highly prosperous and technologically advanced, while others are struggling to attract investment and retain partnerships while operating in highly volatile economies. That said, they share a history. The first NOC was established in the 1930s in Argentina, followed by Mexico's Pemex. And then we saw others follow in the culmination of OPEC in the 1960s. At that time, the objective was to gain greater control over resources. And now, a century later, while they're not all the same, we're calling on them to get greater control over the planet. And that's through a critical lever called methane. And the third thing that we know is that it's all about the money. Allocating funding to oil and gas methane abatement is critical to reducing emissions. Oil and gas methane is severely underfunded. I was shocked to learn that between 2019 and 2020, less than $100 million in global capital flows went to methane mitigation in oil and gas. Honestly, when I read that, it was like trying to set up a lemonade stand to solve climate change. That's just 0.01% of the more than $780 billion that we saw flow to new fossil fuel development in the same period. And many NOCs don't have the financial resources to execute these methane reductions on their own. The International Energy Agency says that NOCs in low and lower middle income countries need $12 billion in financing to achieve the 75% methane reduction we need to see. So that brings me to the three things we can do about it. One, we need to recognize that language drives action and we need to be speaking a common language. NOCs are fighting many fires and methane reduction is often not their top priority. In some markets, as Ben was mentioning, NOCs account for half of government's revenue. They're big drivers of economic growth, and this ask might seem too big. So that's why the first thing we could do is to seek greater alignment with national government priorities that align with the goals of the NOCs. None of us in this room are the United Nations heads, and we're not presidents of countries that I believe of, although if you're here, please do let us know. It's a first step we can do is encourage NOCs to join OGMP 2.0. It's a key step in measuring emissions and also holding NOCs accountable. Setting ambitious methane reduction targets will help NOCs make progress towards that goal, but also set precedent for other NOCs who haven't joined. The second thing that we need to do is hold NOCs to account. Many banks, investors, and other financial institutions have a stake in NOCs. And as a result, it's a unique opportunity to support NOCs in the commitments that they do make and make sure we see those to fruition. These same institutions have to hold NOCs accountable once a commitment's made. IOCs also have a role to play in joint ventures with NOCs, and they could and share financial and technical resources in order to achieve those goals. And third, we have to drive the money. To close the gap, banks and capital markets need to make sure funding methane abatement for NOCs is a top priority. Given several of the large Western banks and other leading financial institutions are invested in NOCs, they have an incentive to participate in financed emissions. There are already tailored financial instruments that can help companies do this. We can explore vehicles like sustainability-linked lending, transition bonds, and project finance models, especially in low and middle income NOC countries that help us identify oil and gas methane reduction opportunities. So what's EDF doing about this? We're in the business to ensure that methane reduction reduces because of the scale of NOCs. They're not going to go anywhere anytime soon, and they may even increase in the future. So how can we develop strategies that help NOCs reduce emissions? And one of our core strategies is working with the financial sector as a lever to provide them with the tools needed to encourage stronger action from NOCs. We're encouraged, though. Recent developments, as we just saw, give reason for optimism in methane reduction because we see it's becoming an increasing priority for NOCs. The formation of the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, or the OGDC, at COP28 last week was a significant milestone because over 25 NOCs just committed to eliminating non-emergency flaring by 2030. That's a feasible target, and it requires formal commitments now to achieve. That said, there still should be scrutiny and reinforcement from the financial community to ensure that there is follow-through. EDF, the Environmental Energy Agency, and UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory will commit to tracking methane emissions using satellites and other tools to make sure companies meet their pledges. All three of these organizations, including EDF, have extensive experience in measurement, analysis, and reporting of methane emissions from fossil fuel operators from around the world. Together, we're hoping to provide an independent, data-driven accounting of methane performance of OGDC signatories. At EDF, we're committed to bringing together a coalition of thinkers, and anyone who touches this topic should try to connect with us and through our work. So as I wrap up today, I just wanted to say we're going to have a lively conversation that goes into the state of methane emissions, ideally debate what's stopping NOCs from joining, see what we've learned coming out of COP28, and understand the nuances of the debate and also the game plan. I hope we provoke some good conversation around this. So my call to action as I leave you today, if your work just touches energy policy or energy finance and you're compelled to come here today, just think about what you can do to take progress in this issue. It is within your remit. Leave today, hopefully not only feeling inspired to do something, but also that you know what you can exactly do. We're eager to collaborate with NOCs and members of the financial community at large to understand and encourage action towards these goals. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ben. Thanks so much for having us.
All right, on to part two. Thank you, Leslie, for those comments. That was great. And I just want to say, I think that EDF is a great example of what can be done if you engage in a constructive way with NOCs. You know, even for companies that you don't think is the first movers on methane issues, if you engage with senior management, you know, a lot of change happens from the top down, and we've seen, you know, a huge sea change in company sentiment on this in a short amount of time. So congrats on all the good work. So as a second part of our event today, we're really fortunate to have a guest speaker from Ecopetrol, the Colombian NOC. Ecopetrol is a great example, I think, of a national oil company that has made some pretty significant climate and methane commitments in recent years, including joining OGMP 2.0. So our guest is Santiago Martinez Ochoa. He is head of sustainability and decarbonization at Ecopetrol. He has more than 15 years of experience in the sector. He started his career at BP. He later worked on Colombia's accession plans to the OECD, among other topics. Santiago, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us for this event.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. And it's great to finally have this conversation about NOCs and what the role is in this climate debate.
Yeah, definitely. So lots to talk about. I think it would be helpful for those of us here in the room and online who are not as familiar with Ecopetrol's business, if you could just talk about a broad question first. How do the company's sustainability targets and its climate goals fit with the Colombian government's climate targets? You know, as an NOC, there's obviously a relationship between what the government wants and tells you to do and the company's corporate strategy. Unpack that for us. Great.
And let me first give you a few words about who Ecopetrol is. So we're basically an integrated oil and gas company. We are 88% state-owned, so still an NOC, but we have some of our shares floating in the Colombian and in the New York Stock Exchange. And I'll talk about in a minute what that means also and what has that meant for our sustainability goals. So basically we are present in both upstream, downstream, and midstream. We recently acquired also the largest energy transmission company in Latin America called ISA, and that is part of our, let's say, journey towards let's say, energy transition. So as you said, we are seeking always to align our goals to the government. So Colombia has an NDC that proposes a 51% reduction by 2030, and we are, of course, contributing to that NDC. I would say that if you think about the goal that the energy and mine sector has as a whole in Colombia, we're probably contributing to half of Colombia's target. We're currently, if you think about Ecopetrol's emission, we represent around 4.5% of Colombia's emissions if you take into account scopes 1 and 2. You already know our targets. We are parts of the OEGDC. We made that commitment public in the previous COP28. So that means that we're committed to zero routine flaring, to near zero methane emissions by 2030, net zero emissions scopes 1 and 2 by 2050. But we also have some intermediate goals, a 25% reduction by 2030, and we, let's say, target our emission reductions on a yearly basis. And very, very quickly, and not to prolong it too much, how are we proposing to do that? So first, by diversifying part of our portfolio, so that acquisition that I just mentioned is part of that conversation, and we are slowly and gradually moving to other business lines related to hydrogen and renewables. We incorporated a carbon price in Ecopetrol that will go up to $50 per ton by 2030. So we're trying to optimize our portfolio that way. And we also, of course, have our programs to reduce emissions on methane reductions, and we can talk in more detail about that in a minute, on renewable energies, energy efficiency, reduction of flaring, and the like. And last but not least, there will be a component of residual emissions that you cannot abate, and there we are moving into the natural climate solution space. Colombia has 60% of its emissions come from deforestation and land use changes, so we also want to play a role in that respect. So in a nutshell, we are in a way trying to align ourselves with the government's NDC while contributing to the country between 12 and 20% of the national budget. So we have, let's say, a significant portion of the budget still depends on Ecopetrol, and that's sort of that's part of the conversation that we're having, is how do you maintain that value for the country while you transition? So we have a responsibility on that front as well.
Yeah, great. So as you mentioned, you're a listed company. You have both domestic and international investors. And NOCs come in all different varieties. Many NOCs are 100% state-owned, but there are a lot of listed NOCs. And so a perpetual question is what level of influence do outside investors have? How much can they get an NOC to move on issues like climate? I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the types of investor engagement you've had on climate issues and how much that drives the company targets. And maybe you could talk about both domestic and international investors in that respect.
Great. So I would say that I meet on a regular basis with investors, probably once a week, if not once a month at least. So I'm having these conversations frequently. What I can tell you is that they had a lot of influence in our conversations regarding the targets that we ended up having, particularly the international investors. So we had a lot of conversations with the likes of BlackRock and other investors in Ecopetrol, so very, let's say, active discussions on that front. But I wouldn't say that they're the only stakeholders that, let's say, created that pressure. So you have different stakeholders. You have the government, you have financial investors, you have local communities, new generations that don't necessarily want to work in an oil and gas company. So I would say that, yes, financial investors played a crucial role, but I would say that there are other stakeholders that also, let's say, created the conditions for us to take a more aggressive stand around climate change. The difference between international and national investors, I would say we are having conversations with both. Actually, probably the first conversation I had in Ecopetrol was with a Bancolombia, which is one of the largest banks in Colombia, and it was actually it was critical for us because it was the first time that we actually understood how that type of stakeholder was looking at us. So at some point, Ecopetrol had decided to step away from CDP, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and other reports, and the conclusion was that we were not looking very good in those indexes. So we decided to come back, be much more transparent and much more aggressive, and I think the results we've seen a lot of improvement in our indexes and our indicators related to ESG matters.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit more detail about methane reductions. So the entire industry is going through this process of figuring out what works, experimenting with different detection technologies, deploying things in the field, doing studies, trying to figure out cost effectiveness. How's Ecopetrol doing this? How far advanced are you in the journey? What have you learned?
So we started this journey probably in 2019. We started measuring emissions with bottom-up technologies. Actually, we had a lot of collaboration with the Canadian government. We had a lot of capacity building collaboration with them. We got some equipment loaned to us, and that was fundamental because then we started to identify the problem. I think that the first thing that you need to do is really understand and come to terms that there are some emissions. So as a result of that, we ended up having probably 8 times more the emission amounts that we had initially thought. We then started piloting with other technologies. We did overflights in all of our direct operations. And we've been, let's say, doing both bottom-up and top-down measurements that now cover, I would say, a bit more than 95% of our direct operated assets. And the next challenge is now to be able to measure non-operated assets. So we're going to continue to pilot some of these technologies. We're probably going to test out drones next year. But this, let's say, it's now part of the, let's say, of the operational thinking in Ecopetrol. And the other piece to this is that there is regulation now in place in Colombia. So it's we're not only doing this as a result of us joining OGMP, but it's also, let's say, part of the regulation. And I think one reflection is that it really paid off to move ahead of regulation. So once the regulation was in place, we already had a very good understanding of what we had in terms of methane. And well, of course, we're now implementing all the different LDAR programs to achieve our goals.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we tend to focus on methane regulations in the United States and Europe, but as you noted, Colombia has passed laws on managing methane from oil and gas. Canada has, Nigeria, a number of other countries too. It's a learning process, and Ecopetrol has lots of partnerships. So can you talk about how you've learned through cooperation with joint venture partners, Western companies, Asian companies, and others?
So we're actually now expanding our programs to our partners. Those are not easy conversations. Sometimes your contractual agreements, let's say, facilitate those conversations. In other cases, they do not. Having regulation, particularly in Colombia, makes it easier because, again, now it's a matter of mandatory compliance, and that, let's say, facilitates the conversation. So we are in the process of expanding, let's say, our decarbonization plans to our partners. And this is, again, an ongoing process. And what you see there is that you have companies with different levels of maturity. Some of them are very well advanced. They have their inventories. They know what they have. Some of them are just beginning their journey. So our goal there has been to, let's say, have those types of discussions depending on the level of maturity of each of these companies and try to move the whole industry in Colombia in that direction. But I would say in terms of partnerships, this is a space where I think you need a lot of collaboration. So we heard from the EDF a few minutes ago. We had a lot of support at some point by some of the experts in EDF, the Clean and Climate Air Coalition, OGCI. So I think this is a space where collaboration is key, especially because it's such a novelty. It's probably in a few years it's going to stop being one, but there's still a lot of room to learn at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that Ecopetrol joined OGMP 2.0 recently. There's this term used to describe OGMP 2.0. It's a community of practice. I think one of the significant parts of the program is that it kind of provides an avenue for companies to get together and talk about technical solutions and talk about the complexities of moving to measurement-based systems for monitoring methane. So maybe you could talk about that. And then I think the final question, I'm conscious of time, is I wonder if you could also comment on Ecopetrol's role as a Latin American NOC. There's a broad spectrum of different state companies in Latin America. Some are pretty active on climate issues, others are not as active. Can you talk about the kind of dialogue that you have among Latin American NOCs and cooperation and partnerships on issues like this?
Great. So regarding your first point, we were actually one of the first companies before OGMP actually was defined. We participated for, I would say, more than a year in putting together our GMP. So we were really first movers in that space. And that helped us a lot as well, because we were behind the curtains in understanding really what was going to look like. So we had that helped us prepare much more before actually joining OGMP. We are very happy this year because we finally, after 3 years, managed to achieve the gold standard. It was announced also during COP. Now the challenge is how do you maintain it? So it's one thing is getting there, and now how are you going to maintain the level of measurements or reductions, etc. So that's probably the next challenge. In terms of collaboration with other NOCs, first I would mention probably ARPEL, which is this association that convenes other oil and gas players in the region. We are part of the Decarbonization committee set up by ARPEL, so I think that's an interesting space where you're seeing more collaboration between Latin American and NOCs, and this just started, so I think there's a lot of room to grow there. But I think we've also managed to have collaboration between beyond Latin America. So to give you an example, we had a month ago a very interesting workshop with the World Bank and representatives from 5 African governments and companies in Colombia. We shared with them our experience around methane. So I think this kind of collaboration between NOCs will probably continue. And actually during COP, I had very interesting discussions with some of these African companies. And there you actually see how big of a challenge it is for some of these countries to decarbonize while they also need to produce some revenues to meet other necessities around poverty, access to electricity, etc. So I think having this sort of conversations and being able to differentiate some of the pressures that the NOCs are facing in this debate, I think is crucial.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I totally agree. So one of the things my buddy Fareed Mohammadi taught me many years ago is that NOCs learn from NOCs. And so if you think about what creates this ripple effect throughout the oil and gas industry and stronger action from NOCs, a lot of it happens through dialogue with each other, because even though NOCs are very different, you have similar responsibilities, you kind of understand each other. And I think that's what made COP28 kind of a unique opportunity to bring more NOCs into the fold. I also think it's really important to promote this idea of regional champions. You know, if there's one NOC in each region that's leading, it can do a lot to bring other NOCs along with it and provide that kind of learning opportunity. So all that is to say, I think Ecopetrol is doing good work in the space. Really grateful to you for joining us online from Colombia to share all these lessons with us. Everyone in the audience, if we can just give a quick thank you to Santiago Martinez for joining us. Really appreciate it. So what we're going to do now is take a couple minutes. We're going to flip the stage. We're going to bring a few more people on stage for our first panel. So for the online audience, just stick with us for a couple minutes. While we do that, we will be right back. And we'll be back in just a second. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. We're going to get started with our panel discussion. Those are great remarks from Santiago at Ecopetrol to kick off a lot of the themes I think we're going to talk about in this panel. And I'm really pleased with the way this panel turned out, because we have people from different institutions, different perspectives on this whole methane journey in the oil and gas sector. I'll introduce them briefly. Zubin Bamji, to my immediate right, is manager of the World Bank's Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. That's a multi-donor trust fund with support from governments and companies and multilaterals. Ben Ratner is executive director at JP Morgan Chase. He supports the bank's sustainability strategy and helps integrate sustainability further into the company's efforts to drive inclusive growth. And Dr. Erica Downs is at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia, which is a little-known think tank in New York City that does some work on energy. She's a senior research scholar there. She's an expert on the Chinese NOCs. She wrote an excellent report back in 2021 called Green Giants on the transition strategies of the Chinese NOCs. So it's a really excellent panel to kind of carry the conversation forward. And I'm hoping we can make this as conversational as we can. For those of you in the audience, we'll have probably 10 minutes or so at the end for questions and answers. There's a microphone in the back, so get thinking about your questions throughout the talk. For those of you who joined us online, you should be able to submit questions with the button on the screen called Ask Questions. We'll keep an eye on that throughout the chat and hope we have time to turn to some of those towards the end of the conversation. So, Zubin, why don't I start with you? You were at COP. You're alive and here to tell the tale. You must be very tired, but glad that you could join us. Maybe you could start by introducing what the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Fund is and what's happened recently with it. As I mentioned at the outset, it's $255 million now, I think, allocated to this program for technical and financial assistance. What is it? What's the goal?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks for the invitation. This is a fun time for us in many ways. Some of you may recall the World Bank's been involved in gas flaring for the last 20 years or so, and we had a small trust fund focused on flaring. You can imagine it was mostly devoted to technical assistance to developing country governments, those with the least resources and capacity to address flaring. And that's all we really had the resources for. But now we're happy that a lot of companies and governments have stepped up and said, look, this is an opportunity to really help with the climate agenda. You guys should focus on methane as well. Actually, I shouldn't phrase it that way because we wanted to do this anyway. So we spent the last year or so developing and designing a new trust fund that includes methane and fugitive methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. The statistic that I always like to share, Ben, is this one that sort of really frames the issue well for us at the World Bank, which is if you say anthropogenic methane emissions from the oil and gas sector are about a quarter or thereabouts, well, out of that quarter, 50%, if not more, comes from developing country NOCs in the oil and gas sector. So it's a huge problem and something that the World Bank's well suited to address. Now, what are we going to do with this money that we hope to see coming in over the next few months? We'll continue the work we did on flaring. So the technical advice could be helping a government develop a regulatory framework or to make sense of all the technologies that are out there on flaring, whether they're small scale or other. So we'll continue to do that work, but what we really want to focus on now is taking, say, 90% or so of the money that we'll get to focus on getting these developing country governments and NOCs to actually do the projects that reduce the methane and the flaring. So what does that mean? That means that we'll step in and help them do methane detection campaigns, quantification, analysis to help them better understand that. We'll do pre-feasibility studies and feasibility studies. We'll work on the regulatory side of things still. Anything that really sort of guides these NOCs to take action and then do the projects. There's sort of some criteria that we're going to be looking for because, as many of you can understand, in these developing countries, it's hard for them to make sense of all of the initiatives that are out there. This is, as Ben said and others have said, it's a sort of a learning process for all of us. So if you're a developing country and you have limited resources and capacity, you kind of do need that sort of support from a variety of organizations, including the World Bank, to make sense of it all. And what we want to do is continue to provide that support, help them lock arms with them and go on this journey together. But more importantly, what we think is that the governments have to demonstrate a long-term commitment, a programmatic commitment, if you will. So it's not sort of like this one-off thing that they're going to address methane emissions from their oil and gas sector and then wave bye-bye. We want to see some demonstrated commitment. So you can imagine us going to a government and saying, look, this is all great, but we really need you to make a commitment before we devote some of this limited money that we have. So one thing we're going to be looking for is these governments and NOCs to sign up for OGMP 2.0. We think it's powerful, it's needed. So that's one thing that we're going to look for. The second thing is they have to make the commitment to zero routine flaring as well, if they haven't already. We started that initiative, as some of you know, back in 2015 before the Paris COP. And we've now got well over 90 governments and companies that have made that commitment. So that's been moving well. Now we need to see the action on the ground. And the third thing we're going to ask governments and NOCs to do is have a set target on methane intensity near zero. And that's something that we're looking for them to do. Now that's just to access the funds that we'll have. If they need just ground level type support, technical assistance type stuff, we'll of course do that, and that's part of our job. So that's basically the fund.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues with NOCs is that, as we've mentioned a couple times already, it's a very diverse group. Some of these are wealthy companies with lots of revenue, and they've got plenty of human capacity. Others are kind of struggling with where to start. So it sounds like this program is providing that kind of technical input and advice that a lot of them
That's
need.
right, Ben. I mean, I'll give you an example, and Santiago mentioned it a short while ago. When we go to some of these governments, they really just have no idea how to address all of this at once. There's a lot of pressure. We were sitting across from a government most recently in the Middle East, and the guy looks at me and he says, hey, you know, you're here this week. Next week, we've got OGCI coming. The following week, the European Commission will be here. And then the next few weeks, we've got all these organizations and industry players coming and trying to work with us and put pressure. And it's just hard for us to make sense of it all. And I said, I totally recognize that. Yeah. We're happy to help you with that. And one of the things we did, as Santiago said, was you know, not every NOC can be Saudi Aramco or do what they're doing in Norway. Again, these are limited resources and capacity. So what we did is we took 3 African governments and said, let's go to Bogota. Let's see what they're doing in Colombia, because this is something that's doable for your government. And what the regulator has done in Colombia is a tiny sort of shoestring operation, 1 room, 1 guy, just a handful of staff monitoring methane emissions and flaring. And we thought it was brilliant because, you know, you can't go from here all the way up to here. You kind of have to do this incremental growth and see how things work out for you. And their budget for this little operations center was like $1 million or $2 million. Again, whether it really makes a big change, we'll see, but it's a good starting block for a lot of these developing countries.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a lesson for all of us.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Thanks.
Ben, so your company published a report recently called the Methane Opportunity. You're here to bring the financial sector perspective on why methane matters and what financial sector institutions are doing about this. But as part of that report, JP Morgan set a portfolio-wide emissions intensity reduction target. Why are you focusing on methane reductions?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben, and to CSIS and the EDF sponsors for helping to make this possible. What an exciting time to be working on this issue. I think this was the COP where methane transcended from being a niche issue to a now issue, and the opportunity is in front of us. So look, 3 reasons that we invested in developing and sharing our point of view through this methane emissions opportunity report just a couple weeks before COP28. And to your point, Ben, it really starts with the targets. So let me explain that and put it in perspective. A year ago today, if we'd been sitting here together, at that time our company, JP Morgan Chase, was managing toward 3 sector targets for 2030 for our so-called financed emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with companies in the real economy that we support. Those targets were not yet aligned with a net zero emission trajectory. Today we have 9 targets, all of which are aligned with a net zero emissions trajectory. This is to reduce the carbon intensity of our financing portfolio and do so in a way that's supportive of our clients, helping them take advantage of opportunities and to navigate, of course, challenges and risks along the way. One of the important updates that we made, and had the chance to talk with some of the groups here and get the benefit of their input, is around operational emission reduction, oil and gas, scope 1 and 2. That target for us now is 45%, 2030. Again, weighted average basis across the financing portfolio, larger, smaller oil and gas companies. And when you look at the framework, our methodology of what can deliver emission reductions in intensity that big, that fast, it will surprise few in this room. It's largely around methane and flaring reductions on the order on average of, let's say, 80 to 90%. So this methane report was and is a companion piece to dig deeper into that actionable opportunity, that now opportunity. The second thing is just the broad-based benefits that we see in methane and flaring reduction. And I think about the slides that you started with, Ben, talking about NOCs and the different considerations and goals, including around revenue and economics and energy security and so forth. And we just identified this issue as one that's collaborative, it's not divisive, and these broad-based benefits, not just around climate, of course it's important, but also energy security, reliability, affordability, and business benefits. And we heard from an NOC speaker earlier today, getting ahead of regulations, improving safety, positioning with different stakeholders. And then the last is we've been impressed and encouraged up to senior leadership levels of our company with the technology innovation, including around monitoring and measurement. I mean, I remember 8 or 10 years ago in my prior life working on different methane tech innovation challenges. In those days, the idea of a continuous methane monitoring system was just that. It was an idea. Mm-hmm. It was futuristic, right? Measurement was considered a holy grail that wasn't there yet. And it's been impressive to see what entrepreneurship, what the free market, what ingenuity, including here in the US, has delivered in terms of what's possible in terms of technologies. If we don't solve this problem, it will not be for a lack of technology tools. And at JP Morgan, we want to play an active role in helping those markets grow, including in banking some of those most promising solutions providers.
Yeah, I mean, the pace of change in methane detection is pretty amazing. It's like every week there's a new vendor with a new technology coming out. And of course, it's confusing for companies to sort through all this, and it takes time and it requires some investment to do that. But I think supporting those companies as they grow to actually provide the technology solutions is part of it, beyond helping NOCs figure out the targets and help them get there. So thanks for that, Ben. Erica, let me turn to you. So you're an expert on the Chinese NOCs. You've been publishing on the Chinese NOCs for years. You know their assets, their portfolios, their behavior. Before we get into some of the issues around methane, I think it would really help the audience to just talk about the transition strategies of the big three Chinese NOCs, what climate targets they've set, and how it's evolved in the last couple of years.
Sure. So China's NOCs are under pressure from a number of different sources to prepare for the energy transition. There's the Chinese government and the expectation that the companies will help do their part to help China achieve its national carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals. There is pressure from investors, and this is pressure on the internationally listed subsidiaries of these companies. Investors want them to do more and disclose more about how they're addressing climate change. And finally, the companies are looking at peak oil demand, by 2030 in China, as well as peak gasoline in China by the middle of this decade, if not this year. And so the number of sources of pressure, and in response to that, the companies are doing a number of different things. One thing that they're doing is looking to produce more natural gas. Now, natural gas obviously is not carbon neutral, but the companies believe that it has a role to play as a bridge fuel, and they do not see natural gas peaking in China until about 2035, 2040. This is also making a virtue of necessity in the sense that they are producing more and more gas and less oil domestically. So that's one thing they're doing. They're also moving into higher end chemicals because they want to be able to produce chemicals to make the things that the world needs for the energy transition. So be it solar panels or wind turbines or lithium-ion batteries. Finally, they're also looking to use renewable energy to power more of their operations. And this is also being done under guidance from above, and that the government did come out earlier this year with targets for the amount of natural gas and diesel that should be displaced by wind and solar in their operations. And finally, the companies are also investing in carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects and green hydrogen, although neither of these are money makers yet for the companies. And finally, when it comes to targets, all of the big three NOCs have carbon peaking and neutrality targets. PetroChina was the only company to come out with a carbon neutrality target, that's 2050, before the Chinese government came out with their 2030 carbon peaking, 2060 carbon neutrality target. And then, of course, after those targets were announced in September 2020, the other two of the big three NOCs, Sinopec and CNOOC, came out with their own targets, as did a number of other central state-owned enterprises in China.
Yeah, there's lots to follow up on there. Let me stick with you for a minute, Erica. Maybe you can talk about the role of investors a little bit more. So all three of the big Chinese NOCs have investors, they have international listings. You know, for all NOCs, this is an issue that really differs. What's the level of influence of investors generally relative to the central government? But in the case of the big three Chinese NOCs, I mean, how much do investors matter in driving their behavior?
So, no, that's a great question. I think that investors obviously don't matter as much as central government goals and objectives when it comes to preparing for the energy transition, but that does not mean that investors are completely irrelevant. And one thing that I learned while researching the report that you mentioned in your introduction, the one that I did back in 2021, as well as preparing a report that I co-authored that came out just last month on the climate disclosures of Chinese companies in high carbon emitting industries, I did learn that there are institutional investors that have been engaging with the big three NOCs, with listed subsidiaries, for a number of years now on climate change, and they've gone to these companies and said, we're not happy with the amount of information that you're disclosing. We'd like to see you disclose more. We'd like to see you do more. And some of these investors have, written up their experiences with these companies, and they sort of indicated what they've talked about, what workshops, what types of workshops and other engagements they've had, and then also some of the changes that occurred after these engagements took place. So, for example, in one case, there was an investor that talked about how after they engaged with the NOCs, that the NOCs started to come out and in their ESG reports talk about the different types of climate risks that they face and what they're doing as a company to address those risks. So I think that investors are playing a role, but definitely not as large a role as the central government in terms of dictating and encouraging these companies to make progress in this area.
Yeah, I think another interesting issue to track with NOCs is, how central they are to the energy transition in each country. And in China, of course, these are massive companies. I mean, all three of the NOCs are huge. The workforces are huge. But they're not necessarily being asked to deliver all of China's transition goals, right? You've got any number of private companies that are innovating in all these low carbon energy areas. So it sounds like they're exploring hydrocarbon adjacent issues. They're doing natural gas, hydrogen, some stuff on CCUS, but maybe not central to all the transition goals and investments. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think obviously in China there is a huge landscape, and you have lots of other companies in high carbon emitting industries like steel and cement and thermal power that obviously have big roles to play. And I should also mention, in the case of China's NOCs, that preparing for the energy transition, it's not their only responsibility, and it's not the most important one, that ensuring that China has the oil and gas supplies that it needs is job number one.
Yep, got it. Okay. Zubin, let me turn back to you. I want to pick up on the theme that you mentioned, which is about partnerships and learning. So a lot of NOCs need technical help, they need support, they need to know where to start. The World Bank's got this pot of funding now, and because you're a multilateral institution, you kind of have a special position in engaging with governments and companies. But what kind of partnerships are you striking to do this? How do you do that kind of capacity building for NOCs?
Yeah, that's a key point, Ben. Thanks for that. In the past year, as we've been designing the trust fund and talking to a lot of the associations, people in this space, became pretty clear to us that we needed to do a little bit of a environmental scan, if you will, to see who was doing what. So that was one of the first steps we took. And it was amazing to see how many organizations are in the methane abatement. And it was key for us in terms of seeking the funding from the companies and governments to make sure that we weren't doing duplicative work and that we were complementary. And then bringing all of the stakeholders together. The convening power of the World Bank, as you kind of alluded to, is really a key part for us. And we want to make sure that everybody has a voice at the table, and we're pretty strident about that because we think that's the most effective way to go. So whether it's EDF, that's been working in this for a long, long time and done terrific work, or many other organizations, industry associations, we're going to work with IMEO on OGMP 2.0, advocate for that, help governments achieve that. We'll also work with EDF and other organizations as we disperse these funds that we have, because part of what we want to do, Ben, is use these funds that have been given to us for grants, right? And that doesn't necessarily always mean that we at the World Bank will do the work on these grants. We can do what's known as recipient executed, so organizations can come to us, say, here's an opportunity, a project we'd like to do. Will the World Bank help finance and fund this? And our response will be, yes, we will provide catalytic funding. I mean, 250 sounds a lot, right? And it is compared to what we used to have. But as was stated at the outset, the magnitude of the problem is so many more billions of dollars. So we're viewing this as a catalytic fund that will help these governments get to that space. So one of the partnerships that we're looking for can be any organization that's going to work in this space and help reduce methane. And then what we would do is have a supervisory role to ensure that every single penny from our fund is going to where it should be, and that you don't have the brother-in-law of the king benefiting from it, so to speak. That kind of thing. It's bread and butter for us at the bank, right? This is something we do daily, make sure that our funds are used widely. So partnerships, absolutely key.
Okay. Let me ask a follow-up question. We actually got a question from the audience on this too. The selection process, do you have a short list? Do you have companies, NOCs that are already knocking on your door? Do you have a kind of priority list that you're going to start with? How's that going to unfold?
Yeah, we kind of do. I won't mention it here just because there's so many considerations, but as you can imagine, the key considerations will be lowest capacity, lowest resources, but great opportunity for methane abatement. So whether it's huge plumes or a lot of volumes of gas flaring going up into the atmosphere. So that's how we would prioritize the greatest opportunities, but then also those governments and developing countries that have the least resources and just would really need a lot of help. So that's where we want to step in and support.
Okay, makes sense. Ben, let me turn back to you. Thinking about the corporate side, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about corporate engagement on some of those priority areas that you mentioned. So the report, I think, laid out 8 different focus areas for companies on methane reductions. I think I heard you say there's 9 now, but we don't have to go over all 9. Maybe you could just pick some of your favorites. Like, how is JPMorgan Chase engaging with companies on a couple of those selected focus areas to try to encourage fast action?
So to clarify, our climate program broadly includes 9 targets across many different sectors of the economy, including but not limited to oil and gas. The methane framework that we introduced has 8 elements, but thank you for the chance to clarify. And one of the key things that we did in developing that perspective, that framework for methane, those 8, was to put forward a view of two tracks, both what is best in class and also what are positive actions. And this just speaks to one of the themes, I think, from our conversation already, which is that companies, including NOCs, are in different places of their journey. Continuous improvement is an important part of how we see opportunities and positive and inclusive, framing and messaging. There may be, three of the elements that stand out to me when I think about NOCs, and I should say we pointed to OGMP 2.0 as best in class. We're supportive of OGMP 2.0. I think many companies are there already. Others may not quite be ready to take that step, and I think they should be supported and not shamed. So for NOCs, maybe three elements that stand out to me from our framework. One is around monitoring. I mean, I've lost track of the number of stories that we've heard over the years of that aha moment, that light bulb moment being the use of infrared cameras or other technologies to just get a vivid, real-world appreciation of what the emissions profile is. Reduction plans. I mean, in some ways, methane's like the classic 80-20 problem. This is not about perfection. It's about identifying what your biggest opportunities for emission reduction are first and tackling those. And that's something that a company can do whether or not it's ready to take a best-in-class step, such as joining OGMP 2.0. And then I think the theme of collaboration has come out from a couple of the remarks over the course of the day. We point into third-party engagement as one of those key best practices. Someone earlier said NOCs learning from NOCs. I thought that was a really powerful concept. I think you may have talked about the community of practice. I would point out one of our best-in-class ideas, or recognizing something that's developing in the marketplace, is bringing in a third party to do independent reviews and independent auditing of a company's approach to methane emissions. Not in a punitive way, but in a supportive way. Could be in the context of certified gas groups such as MIQ, I think are interesting. And then to the other part of your question, Ben, which was, I think, around engagement. We do a lot through our Center for Carbon Transition, which is a part of our firm that was stood up in the investment bank several years ago to really spearhead many of our efforts, not only around setting the kinds of targets that I've had the chance to talk about, but also really engaging with clients to give them research, advice, perspective, and yes, of course, financing to help them meet their own goals and move forward in their decarbonization journeys. And so I expect this is already an important topic that's on the agenda for those kinds of client engagements that we have, and I think will be perhaps even more so next year and in the years to come.
Yeah. It might be early days, but I wonder if you could share thoughts on what's the opportunity set with NOCs specifically. So you've laid out all these opportunities for engagement.
Yeah.
But with this kind of tough nut to crack, the national oil company landscape, what do you think?
So I agree with the prior comments that the tools in the toolkit for a Western financier or investor may be a little bit more limited with regard to NOCs, but that does not mean that there are no tools or that there is no role. I actually might start by saying we're in uncharted territory. You talked about the oil and gas decarbonization charter. I mean, this really interesting work from World Bank that we very much welcome, by the way. Many more NOCs and other companies joining this conversation, making pledges. It seems to me that as Westerners, many of us, maybe not all of us participating here or virtually, having some humility, some curiosity, a learning attitude as we approach this question of how NOCs can best be supported and encouraged on this journey, I think is in order, rather than assuming that we all have it sort of figured out ex ante, which I'm not sure is the case. So a couple of the tools, even some of the NOCs who, almost by definition are not, do not have equity stakes out with market participants, public market participants and investors, you may rely on the capital markets or may rely on private pools of capital for debt or for credit. And that may create opportunities, again, for conversations, for dialogues that are supportive about how perhaps particular new projects, new investments can be de-risked or can be future-proofed when it comes to things like the oil and gas Scope 1 opportunities that we're talking about today. So again, seat at the table through debt and credit, it creates or can create a chance for a conversation. OGMP 2.0, of course, has come up a few times, and it's been pointed out. All of the joint ventures and some groups here have done a lot of analysis, really mapping out the joint venture network. As more IOCs and others participate in OGMP 2.0 and look to those non-operated assets, some of which are with national oil companies, is that a natural place where financiers and investors can, again, be supportive with ideas, with capital, maybe with financial products? We can talk a little bit about that perhaps later. I think Leslie brought that up. And then one other idea, and I would carefully caveat this as a emerging idea, is there's been a lot of talk about voluntary carbon markets. There's a lot of talk about methane. I am curious for the best thinking of people here and others over time about whether voluntary carbon markets pursued with integrity and transparency and the parameters that we would expect and want to see could provide a additional source of capital, a revenue stream that can be supportive as different companies, including those who have more capital needs and need more help, work in perhaps the earlier stages of their methane journey. So those are a few ideas, and I think a number of investors and financiers have gotten pretty adept at navigating voluntary carbon markets and have different interests in wanting to see those markets grow. So is that an emerging frontier? I put it to the group for discussion at the reception later.
I think it is, but to be continued. Thanks a lot, Ben. Erica, I want to talk a little bit in more detail about the methane commitments of the Chinese NOCs. So I put up those tables earlier and showed membership in different voluntary schemes and organizations. The Chinese NOCs have done some, so CNPC is part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, has been for a long time. But by and large, they're kind of absent from a lot of these multilateral voluntary schemes. Why is that? Do you think that they're not quite ready yet? Is there some concern about data transparency or signing on to these things? What do you make of the fact, for example, that the Chinese NOCs didn't join the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter?
Yeah, no, great question. I suspect that why the NOCs are largely absent from a lot of these initiatives may have to do with feeling not quite ready. And here I'm thinking of an interview. This was about China writ large, but I think it applies to the NOCs as well, that China's chief climate negotiator gave at COP on the issue of methane. And he said, we're sort of late to the methane issue. Our data is unclear. Our regulations aren't quite what they should be. There's absolutely a willingness in China to address this issue, but we have some challenges. And I think to a certain extent, that would apply to the companies as well. PetroChina and Sinopec Corporation, I think, only recently started disclosing methane emissions. It might have been in 2019 for one, 2020 for the other. And that's important because, of course, you can't manage what you don't measure. Yep. And CNOOC Limited, in their most recent ESG report, when they talked about methane, they said we're still trying to get a handle on what our methane emissions are. So I do wonder if not feeling quite ready, if not wanting to sort of get out there and make an agreement when they don't feel like comfortable with their knowledge of what emissions are might be one factor. And then looking at the oil and gas decarbonization charter, I can give you sort of a company by company rundown of sorts. So one Chinese company did sign. It was not one of the big three. It was Zhenhua Oil. I suspect they signed because they are not a really big producer. So I think meeting the goal, the methane goal of the charter is not going to be as heavy a lift for them as it would be for the other companies. I think for CNOOC, they probably did not sign, again, because they're working to get their methane emissions in order. I was a little bit surprised, actually, with PetroChina and Sinopec, just because they have, they do have a handle on their emissions. So I'm actually waiting to see what's coming, if something more comes out on why the no signing in the next few days and weeks. And then finally, also in terms of what the NOCs are doing, they have, back in 2021, the big three NOCs, as well as other oil and gas producers in China, formed the China Methane Alliance. And CNPC was, and I think was the first, I think they still are the president, and that group of companies has a methane intensity reduction target. And so that sort of struck, and I was sort of wondering how much of that came and grew out of CNPC's experience with OGCI, where there is a collective methane intensity reduction target. So I think the companies are doing stuff, and I think they probably will be doing more. Both as the Chinese government came out with their methane emissions control plan, and even though there are no hard targets in that, there is a call to the oil and gas companies to take action. So I expect we'll see more in this space.
I mean, I also think it was just a mad rush to get things signed before COP28, so it's quite possible they'll join later once they figure out what all this means. One more question for you, Erica. On methane more broadly, there's been this effort that the State Department's international climate negotiators have been undertaking for years now, which is, despite all the tensions, and there are many between the U.S. and China, there's this desire for closer cooperation on climate issues. I think there's kind of this belief that if the U.S. and China can't do things together, then it's going to be much harder for the world to accomplish climate goals. And that includes methane. So in the run-up to COP28, we saw this announcement that the U.S. and China were going to have a kind of meeting on non-CO2 gases. There was an announcement made at this meeting that happened in California pretty soon before the COP. I just wonder what you make of that and how much potential you see for U.S.-China collaboration on methane that might affect oil and gas companies.
So I absolutely do see potential for cooperation in this area. I think the Sunnyland statement that was issued by the two countries before COP, in a way, picks up where they left off. I mean, if we go back to the Glasgow COP, there was sort of a joint statement signed on taking climate action in the 2020s, and methane was a really big part of that. It was one of the most detailed parts, and so I view the Sunnyland statement in a way as picking up where they had left off with Glasgow, in that there is a fairly detailed discussion of what the companies, what the two countries are going to do, both in terms of immediately standing up working groups, technical exchanges, both working sort of separately to implement their methane emission control plans. And I definitely see this as an area where both countries can learn from each other. Both countries have rising methane emissions, and so I expect there are things that they can talk about and practices that they can share to address these issues. So this is actually, I think this is one of the methane issue was one of the most important parts of the Sunnyland's statement, and it's one that I'm optimistic about.
Yeah, it seems more concrete and achievable than some of the other things on the U.S.-China agenda, so I appreciate the optimism. That's good. We are going to turn to audience questions in a minute, so get your questions ready. I'm keeping an eye on what's coming in from online as well. Zubin, let me turn back to you, though. There's always this issue around, you signed a pledge, so what? How do you ensure that companies stick to agreements or pledges that they've made? And especially if you're going to extend financing. I think you mentioned already that you want to ensure this is durable and that companies continue to carry out actions. So how are you planning to do that? How is that going to be built into the program design?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have the best response for you, other than this is something that we do on a regular basis at the bank, right? Because you're dispersing millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and accountability, checks and balances, full transparency are all tenets of, the bank's work in this space. I mean, I kind of view this, Ben, similar to how regulation is, right? So sometimes we advise governments that they need to have their regulatory frameworks in place, as somebody said earlier. That's sort of a foundational piece, but what good is regulation if you don't have the enforcement on, the other side? I can think of one country right off the bat that's had regulations in place for a long, long time, but their own NOC has not paid a single penny in, flaring penalties or anything like that for decades. So again, regulation is kind of like the same thing with other commitments. You make a commitment, you say you're not going to do any routine flaring after 2030, but is there an enforcement mechanism in your initiative? No, there's just the court of public opinion, if you will, which can be quite powerful, especially in some countries. So that's why it's important for civil society and others to be paying attention to all of this and helping us hold people's feet to the fire. That's a key part of what we hope will happen.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Ben, I want to ask you a question about capital for methane abatement. So you come from a rather large institution. You guys have some influence in this space. But I think there's a sense, as you hinted at earlier, that we just need a lot more capital for methane abatement. Everyone realizes this is an issue that requires really rapid action, and we need lots of people to pitch in. So in this audience, we have people from environmental NGOs, from foundations. I know there are other people from financial institutions that have joined online. Maybe you could just talk about what we need to do to allocate more capital to this problem and get it moving fast.
Well, luckily, I don't have 8 or 9 things for this list, Ben, but I do have 5, so brought it down to just a handful. The one I would start with is around actually continued education. My experience is that methane has been an energy sector issue and a government sector issue for longer than it's been a finance sector issue. And I think there is more work to do to educate, to engage, to contextualize. A comment was made from a prior speaker to the effect that there are big picture debates around traditional energy and climate and transition, and methane is different. There's some truth to that, but I think there are some who would benefit from understanding very clearly where this fits in the big picture and why it matters. So the second one is around accurate data. Of course, there's a great deal of work underway on that. The gloss I would put on that from a finance or investment standpoint is it's tough to invest in an opportunity if the opportunity has been quantified in ways that understate its magnitude by a factor of 2x or 3x or 5x, right? Yeah. So this goes back to one of the points that we made in the paper, which is that as companies shift from desktop-based to measurement-based approaches, the emissions are going to go up. Yep. That's something that should be welcomed and encouraged, not penalized, and it will help to identify the actionable investment opportunities and do them full justice. So the third one is around company-level data and the importance of that. I think about how much of the excellent and important scientific and other literature and work around methane emissions, it's at the basin level. It may be at the national level or the state level. That may be necessary and important for policymakers and the scientific community and others. That's great. May or may not be actionable for the financial sector, which, at least in my experience for these kinds of things, the unit of decision making, the unit of capital allocation, if you will, tends to be the company. So the more that we can get higher quality, company-specific data on the methane emissions opportunity, that will help to foster capital flow. The fourth is around size, and you mentioned the size of JP Morgan Chase, right? Firms like ours are geared to pursue the largest opportunities. And one of the benefits of much of the methane emission reduction cost curve is they are smaller projects and they do have lower price tags. But it also speaks to the need to identify or even perhaps to aggregate those larger, more investable opportunities or sets of opportunities to attract that private capital. And then the last one is around methane abatement financial products. This will never be a green bond. But I think one of the speakers mentioned earlier sustainability-linked loans or other existing financial mechanisms that could be deployed to help abate methane emissions. We are interested in that. COP28 has sparked a group of practitioners who are having conversations of what might be possible. What I would say to this group, this cross-section, is the following. One of the factors that informs investor sentiment is public opinion. And for those of us who want to see more, not less, capital flow into oil and gas methane emission abatement, it is useful for the public opinion to call for that, right? I think folks have gotten the message from civil society for years that putting more dollars into oil and gas is not the desired direction of travel. There should be less financing, not more. Well, this is one where we need more financing, not less. Yep. And so if you want to attract more pools of capital, more institutional investors who are listening, not just to signals from the public, but that's part of an investment process and how views and sentiments and risk appetite is developed, there need to be loud, clear, sustained messages from civil society that this is necessary and important and credible if it's done right.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, I've said before that if you are looking for the biggest bang for your buck in terms of emissions reductions, methane abatement in this industry is it. Sure. So I know people are reluctant to finance a lot of oil and gas related or oil and gas adjacent types of projects, but this is one that I think should be an exception for some institutions. We've got a couple minutes now for Q&A. If you are in the audience and you have a question, I would ask that you go stand behind the microphone so everyone can hear you. And also, I think you'll be on camera for the online audience. We've got a couple minutes for questions, and I know there are a few that have come up from online. So please, introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, it's Andrew Howell from Environmental Defense Fund, and thank you so much, Ben, and to CSIS for bringing together this remarkable discussion. And as Leslie mentioned at the beginning, you know, at EDF, of course, this issue of methane is hugely important to us. We have lots of ways we look at the methane problem and the potential solutions, and one of them is at the finance angle. So it's great to hear finance and investors brought up a number of times today. You know, we talk with investors a lot about methane, and many of them are involved in financing NOCs, but what they tell us is that the way that they're engaging with these NOCs is different and actually quite challenging, and they really need help and assistance in understanding, firstly, some basic things like, you know, what is the methane inventory, you know, what is the nature of the problem we want to ask this company to address, but also, you know, who should we be talking to? You know, what is the governance picture? What are the types of conversations likely to be most effective? And we're doing some work, partly with your help, to try to provide those tools to those investors in making those conversations more effective. But one of the other topics that comes up a lot is what Ben Ratner just mentioned at the end about some financial innovation maybe can also play a role. And I'd love to double click on that with Ben, also with Zubin. So the question to Ben is, can you tell us just a little bit more about some of those types of products? You mentioned maybe some discussions coming out of COP28, but like at JP Morgan, are there explorations of methane abatement financial products? You know, an SLB was mentioned. Are there other things that might be worth mentioning and thinking about as potential solutions? But the question for Zubin is about that reluctance to innovate financially to oil companies, and I know that's been an issue at the World Bank, reluctance to provide this capital. Now you have a pool at the World Bank for methane abatement. Does that represent also maybe a change in that reluctance, more willingness to direct that financing if it's for the right reasons to oil and gas? So 2 questions there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Ben, do you want to start and then Zubin?
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief. Thank you, Andrew. So I think it is relatively early days for exploration about what could be possible in terms of financial innovation, new products, or leveraging existing products with a methane twist or a methane focus. Blended finance is a topic that a number of people have interest in. Again, to have MDBs like the World Bank leaning in on methane and flaring reduction is so constructive. Risk is one of the key considerations that comes up in many financing and investment decisions. That can come up in a context in which there's a question of credit risk or other types of risk that may be related to the low carbon transition or not. Some have expressed interest in whether there could be a blended finance approach on methane abatement, where MDBs or other providers of, let's say, concessional capital can help to take some of the risk out of the equation so that the risk-reward profile can be more actionable and it can be leveraged to get more sort of private capital in. I think that's more conceptual than concrete tomorrow, but there's probably some work to be done there.
Yeah, I would echo what Ben just said. Andrew, we sort of at the ground level on this still, trying to understand what's possible and where we can secure financing. What we do want to do for sure, though, is help governments find the sources of financing. If the World Bank's unable to do it, then that's something that we actually just hired somebody to help us develop a program on financing. What are the types of things we can and can't do? Creative solutions to financing. That's something that we'd love to have EDF and other organizations that are interested in this give us some feedback on what are the options and possibilities here, because it is a little bit, as you said, Ben, early days, right? Maybe not the most satisfying answer, Andrew, but.
Great. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. If you could introduce yourself and just be brief with your question, please.
Can I just add one more point on Andrew's? Sure. There is a evolving, lively discussion, and you know this, around transition finance or financing the transition. That was one of the lively topics at COP28, and it will continue on. There is not yet a unanimity on what the definition of transition finance includes. It might be constructive for groups in civil society who want to see financial flows, that spigot open for methane and flaring abatement, to engage constructively in those transition finance discussions and make sure that there's a spirit of pragmatism that can foster this and not purity tests that could crowd out these kinds of investments. And this gets back to a fundamental point that I was trying to make a few moments ago. Yes, methane can be separate and distinct from some of the highest level discussions and debates on oil and gas, climate, and transition, but help people who are newer to this methane topic understand why it matters and how it plugs in. And let's make sure that as new frameworks and new agreements and new understandings are being developed in the transition finance, sustainable finance ecosystem, that there is ample space for this. Maybe this could even be a proof point of positive action in 2024.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame things. Thanks, Ben. Go ahead.
I am Jay, and I wanted to just ask, if we are successful in this initiative, will it alleviate pressure on the agricultural sector in their quest to reduce methane emissions, or are these mutually exclusive conversations? And then just a follow-up or a separate question is, how are we engaging India, that is not necessarily a methane, excuse me, it is a top methane producer, but they don't have an NOC that exports it's a net exporter.
Let me jump in there if you guys don't mind. So CSIS has actually been doing some work on cross-industry collaboration on methane reduction. And you raise a good point, which is that the methane problem really varies country by country. In India, it's an ag problem. In other countries, the share of methane emissions coming from the waste sector or ag is going to be much larger than energy, so it really varies. I mean, obviously, I think the starting point is that a lot of the quicker fixes and the most cost-effective measures to cut methane are in the oil and gas sector. So it's a saleable product, you keep it in the pipe, you can sell more of it. In ag and waste, I think the challenge is it's pure cost. And you've got a much larger set of stakeholders, they're more dispersed. And so it's not as easy to get at, especially outside North America and Europe, I think, where there's just fewer resources devoted to this. It's starting to change, and it actually was on the agenda at COP. There is some new R&D funding for things like enteric fermentation research. That's by far the largest source of ag methane emissions. So I would say that, the oil and gas stuff is the quicker measures, the faster things that we can do, but it does not obviate the need to do those things in other sectors, and I'm sure that's true kind of across the board.
I would just add, it's an opportunity for me to say the World Bank's not just working on the oil and gas sector. So at this most recent COP, we also announced another trust fund focused on agriculture and waste. They're also just ramping up and trying to understand this better. And so to your question, that equally important, agriculture is bigger than oil and gas, right? So.
Yeah. And Erica, from the China perspective, I'm not sure if you have thoughts on kind of non-oil and gas methane and where we are.
Yeah, so in China, by far and away, the two biggest sources of methane emissions are coal and agriculture. Oil and gas is actually a much smaller part of the picture there when it comes to methane emissions. And then I also actually wanted to go back to something that Andrew had said about investors and the challenges of engaging with NOCs on methane emissions, because that reminded me that there was something I wanted to say when you had asked me about investors engaging with China's NOCs on energy transition issues writ large. And I think that there maybe are some creative things that can be done. When I was doing research for one of these two papers that I mentioned, I was speaking with an institutional investor who engages with, or someone at an institutional investor who engages with Chinese companies in a number of different heavy industries on ESG issues, including climate. And one of the things that he told me that he has done that I thought was really quite interesting is that if a Chinese company in a certain heavy industry comes out with a low carbon roadmap or white paper, that when he meets with other Chinese companies in that same industry, he'll show them that document and say, hey, have you seen this? What do you think about this? And I thought that was really a really interesting way to engage, because then it's not just institutional investor headquartered in New York or London saying, hey, we think you should do more on climate, but it becomes an issue of this company hopefully wanting to make sure that they're on par, if not ahead of their brother companies in China. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, positive peer pressure is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we are just about at time, so unfortunately we're going to have to draw this discussion to a close. The work will continue on NOCs and methane at CSIS. We've just published this report today. You can find it on csis.org. We will do more work on this in the first quarter of next year, and I know many of you in the room will continue all the good work that you've been doing on methane. So I want to thank Zubin and Ben and Erica. Also thank Santiago and Leslie from EDF for joining us, and thank EDF for their support of this project. And thanks to all of you. For those of you who are here in the room, we'll have a reception on the top floor. We'll direct you and tell you where to go. But thank you for joining us. Everyone online, thank you for spending the time with us today. And please join me in thanking all the speakers.